Howdy my totally rockin' tubular gamers, and we're back for another ranking video, and today's is going to be a fun one. It's going to be a much beloved series. We're going to be ranking the entire Half-Life series of games. Yes, Half-Life, one of the most influential series in video games, just period, and is really responsible for Valve Software's growth in the video game industry. Half-Life was a landmark title for not only shooters but PC gaming as a whole, and it really established a lot for first-person shooters. It was one of the first shooters to really have a story with it. It actually had a real story with characters and plot progression and a really strong world as well. Most shooters just didn't really have that at the time. It was the first shooter in my knowledge that was completely seamless. There were no levels, you just continued throughout a world, and the game stayed in first person the entire time. You never left Gordon's eye. It established Valve Software as a serious developer in the PC market, and they still make games even to this day, sometimes. They also created Steam, one of the most influential things to ever come to gaming. And I mean, Steam is basically a stranglehold on PC gaming. It's Steam. And then Half-Life would spawn dozens of mods that have eventually become other games that might arguably be bigger than even Half-Life itself, such as Counter-Strike, probably the most important mod like to ever come to gaming. And it all started with Half-Life. But aside from influencing gaming as a whole, Half-Life rules. This is a great series of first-person shooters, and some of the very best first-person shooters are in the Half-Life series. And a lot of these games are some people's favorite games of all time, with good reason. These are all really highly critically acclaimed games, and so I thought I'd have the real fun task of ranking all the Half-Life games. Yep, ranking worst from best based on shooting, how great the level design is, how easy it is to come back to, just kind of everything. I'm a big fan of just about all these games. I do have some nostalgia for them. I've been playing these games for well over a decade, and some of these games are some of my favorite games ever. I've played through every game multiple times actually, minus Alyx, and have just always had a good time with any of the Half-Life games. So we're going to be just ranking the main series of games by Valve. We're not going to be looking at any mods or any spin-offs such as Counter-Strike or Day of Defeat or anything like that. That includes Half-Life Deathmatch, just the main Half-Life series. Hopefully this list becomes outdated one day when we get Half-Life 3, but we can only wait. As always, like, share, sub, comment, all that good stuff. So, enough dilly-dallying around. What do I think is the worst of the Half-Life games? Let's get into it. I think most people can agree that when it comes to Half-Life games and its expansions, the very worst is Half-Life Blue Shift, a standalone expansion released for Half-Life 1 developed by Gearbox Entertainment. Yes, Borderlands Gearbox Entertainment. So Blue Shift stars Barney Callahan, a character that briefly, and I mean briefly, shows up in the original game for like a split second. He's a security guard that lets Gordon in. Well, this whole expansion is about him. It takes place during Half-Life 1 when all the shit goes down and you're just trying to get the hell out of Black Mesa. There's really not much to go off of here. The story is about as basic as it gets. Barney isn't really further developed either, and it doesn't expand the Half-Life world in any meaningful way. So lacking story aside, the gameplay is very similar to Half-Life 1 in Opposing Force. However, it's a much lesser version of those games for a number of reasons. You still move through Black Mesa, a seamless world, and you fight these creatures, these aliens, and obviously the armed forces, and you solve some occasional puzzles and do some platforming, and that's really it. I know that doesn't sound terribly different from the original Half-Life, but this game really misses the mark in just about everything. When it comes to the pacing, the level design, the encounters, the puzzles, the platforming, it just is nowhere near as good as the original game or Opposing Forces. For starters, the level design is just not that great. It feels very segmented, it doesn't feel as fluid as the original games. The puzzles are just not very well designed. I mean, they're all super basic, and most of the time they just involve you pushing stuff. The platforming, which was never very good in Half-Life to begin with, is really exposed here. And all of the combat encounters feel like lesser versions of combat encounters from other games. There's no new enemies, there's no new weapons, there's no new ideas. It brings really nothing new to the Half-Life table like at all. The game is also like 2, maybe 3 hours long on a first playthrough, so it ends before it even gets started. And the ending is nothing special at all. There's no final boss, there's no big encounter. I don't even think there's like any music in this game either, or if there is, there's very little. There's just really not much going on with this game. This is probably, no. This is the only Half-Life game I do not recommend. It is not worth playing. You'll probably have it if you buy all the Half-Life games on Steam, but it's just not worth playing. There's really nothing here. So our next game is Half-Life 2 Episode 1. Now Episode 1 had the unenviable task of following up Half-Life 2, one of the greatest first-person shooters of all time. Instead of making a full third game and taking forever, they were going to split it up into episodes. We all know how that happened, but here is Episode 1. Now, while I think Episode 1 is still good, it is the weakest of the Half-Life 2 games, but it does have its own merits. It takes place right after Half-Life 2 and sees Alyx getting Gordon out of some rubble, and basically for spoiler reasons, they have to get the hell out of City 17. Most of the game takes place in either the Citadel or City 17. Now, while the original Half-Life 2 had you team up with Alyx a few times, Episode 1 has you team up with Alyx the entire time. Alyx never leaves your side, really. She's with you the whole game. This game is all about building Alyx up, building the relationship between Alyx and Gordon up, and just, it's all about the story mostly. And you know, I gotta say, it's actually pretty cool to have Alyx with you the whole time. She has pretty good AI, she is a good character, I like the dynamic between Gordon and Alyx, and I think the story is probably the strongest part of the entire game. But when it comes to the gameplay, really nothing has changed from Half-Life 2. It plays almost identical to Half-Life 2. There are some minor tweaks here and there, but yeah, it really is basically the same as Half-Life 2. The game has you go through a tightly crafted world, solving puzzles using the gravity gun to get through areas, and of course fighting zombies and the Combine. This game introduces a new enemy, the Zombine, but there's only one new enemy. There's no new weapons here, and half the game you actually don't even have weapons, you just have the gravity gun. But if you enjoyed Half-Life 2, I think for the most part you will enjoy Episode 1, as it does play very similarly. The level design is still pretty good, but I do think the game is lacking in a few areas. My two biggest issues with the game are the pacing and the length of the game. The game starts out very slow. It's really like a crawl, especially by Half-Life standards, as you go through the Citadel pretty slowly with just the gravity gun, and they're really building up the relationship between Alyx and Gordon and just kind of dealing with the repercussions of the previous game. And it just isn't the most exciting. Now, in a full-length game, this really wouldn't be an issue at all, as it's just kind of establishing everything, but Episode 1 is like 2.5, maybe 3 hours long, so like half the game is just this really slow start. But once it finally gets going, it really does get going, and it does improve, and it gets better, and it becomes the Half-Life 2 gameplay that you really fell in love with. The other thing I don't like is I don't like the ending sequence of the game where you have to get these people on the train. You just have to move them back and forth. I've never liked this sequence no matter how many times I've done it. I've just never been a big fan of going back and forth. I think it gets kind of old quickly, and the AI isn't the smartest when it comes to this area. It's not terrible by any means, and it's a fine enough escort mission, I guess, but I've just never really liked it. And again, this wouldn't really be a big issue in a full-length game, maybe just a little point I don't like, but because the game is so short, this becomes a good chunk of the game. This is probably 20% of the game, and I don't really like it. This game really feels like it's kind of setting up Episode 2, and with that in mind, it just isn't as great as the other games on this list. I still do recommend it, it is worth playing, and the story is actually pretty good. It's just, when you compare all the other Half-Life games, yeah, it's kind of near the bottom. Alright, so our next game is Half-Life Opposing Force, another standalone expansion for the original Half-Life by Gearbox Software, but this is much better than Blue Shift. Opposing Force actually looks at the original gameplay and story of Half-Life and actually does expand on it in a couple meaningful ways to create a pretty good expansion all around. Over the years, a lot of people have said that Opposing Force is one of the best expansions to any video game, and I concur. I think it is pretty good. It does add a lot to the Half-Life universe. It has you play as Adrian Shepard, a US Marine, one of the enemy characters in the original game. He goes to neutralize everything at Black Mesa, but quickly finds out that shit has hit the fan and drops his mission altogether just to get the hell out of there. The story is interesting. It actually adds something, unlike Barney's, and where it goes, yeah, it's actually different, and it gets pretty cool with what happens. The story's pretty good, and it has that unbroken storytelling where it stays in first person. I really do enjoy that. Now when it comes to the gameplay, yeah, it is pretty similar to the original Half-Life. You're moving through Black Mesa, the world is actually well designed this time, and you are solving some puzzles, doing some platforming, and getting into a lot of encounters here. Unlike the original game, the Marines will actually help you here. They'll team up and take out enemies with you, and they're way better than the security guards, I will say that. The game actually adds some new weapons even to the mix, like a sniper rifle or the knife. There's also some new enemies to take out as well, so it is different. It's not just reusing all the old stuff from Half-Life 1. It does add new stuff to the mix. The new puzzles are actually decently well designed. The platforming is pretty tolerable for the most part. And the part where you go to Zen isn't even that long either, so that's another bonus. While we're on the subject of length, the game is twice as long as Blue Shift, and it's actually very meaningful. The pacing is pretty decent. I like how everything progresses. It all ramps up. There's a final boss. And it really does everything an expansion should do. It has tight pacing, and it generally is a good time, and I absolutely think that it should be played by anybody who likes Half-Life. Like, if you like the original Half-Life, you will like this game. And so here we have the latest title in the Half-Life series, Half-Life Alyx, released in 2020 exclusively for VR. Now, I don't have a VR headset, so I had to go over to someone's house to go play it, but Half-Life Alyx, despite being in VR, still plays like a Half-Life game, and it really does set a really high bar for VR games that I still don't think has been met after this. The game takes place before Half-Life 2 and has you play as Alyx as she's trying to seize a super weapon belonging to the Combine. The story, and really the storytelling, is still as superb as it always was. Even the fact that it's in VR, it still does tell a very interesting story, and I really do think that the pacing is still absolutely there. It feels like a Half-Life game. Things ramp up, things get crazy, and by the end of it, it was really blowing my mind, and I'll just leave it at that. Now when it comes to the gameplay, with it being in VR, it is a little different than normal Half-Life games. It is a bit slower, and there is a lot more exploration than before, but it really does still feel like a Half-Life game. Instead of the gravity gun, you have the gravity gloves, allowing you to pick stuff up, throw stuff around. And you know, a lot of the game is just exploring the areas, solving the puzzles, using the physics to your advantage. And you know, the physics, they're just as good as they've always been, if not the best. They're really the best physics probably in the whole series. It feels really great to throw stuff around, to pick stuff up. Like, it is just endlessly fun. You can interact with seriously like everything in this game. It is pretty impressive. The game does throw in some survival elements, as the ammo and the health are a lot more limited than other Half-Life games, and you really gotta manage those resources a little bit. But it's nothing too crazy. This isn't Resident Evil. And then you have the combat. The combat feels different from the other Half-Life games, but it still feels really good. It feels really different from the other games, and I really did enjoy it. It is pretty cool. This really is like the very best VR game made. It really raises the bar for all VR games, and it still 2 years later hasn't been touched. Like, how do VR games get any better than this? This is a full-length Half-Life title that you can only play on VR. I don't expect there to ever be a non-VR version, since it's so integrated into the game, and so I guess with that there is some limited accessibility that could hurt it on this list, but it is still a great game. I absolutely recommend it. If you have a VR and you haven't played this, I don't know what you're doing, but go play it. Alright, so here we have Half-Life 2 Episode 2. Now Episode 2 really looks at Episode 1 and goes, well, we did all the world building, we did all the slow methodical gameplay, we really built everything up. Now we're just going to build on top of it. Now it gets way crazier, the story gets awesome. Like, I really like Episode 2. The story obviously continues from Episode 1 and sees them out of City 17, and they're in the wilderness, and most of the game takes place in the woods, and I'll just leave it at that. The story is very good. It is better than Episode 1. It might be the best story, like, of all of the games. Seriously, it's really well done. Alyx is really great, and the pacing of the game is great. Now, something that Episode 1 really didn't have that Half-Life 2 had was a lot of variety and set pieces, and Episode 2 really rectifies this with a lot of set pieces and a ton of variety. You are never doing the same thing in this game, like, at all. You are always doing something different here, and it's always really interesting what you're doing. I think every set piece is more interesting than all of Episode 1. They're all really well thought out, well designed, and actually really fun to play through. Whether you're going through the mines or you're defending the base and driving the car, I really think it is like peak first-person shooter gameplay. It is just absolutely fantastic. The gunplay is great, the levels are great, the pacing is really well done, the puzzles are actually pretty good, the platforming, there's barely any of it. The gameplay is really firing off on all cylinders. I would argue that it might be the very best gameplay that the series has ever seen. It seriously is that good. While it doesn't bring any new weapons to the table, it brings a lot of new enemies and other environmental aspects that you can use to fight these enemies, such as these new bombs to take Striders out. I just think that the combat is, again, the best that the series has ever seen. You will not get bored playing Episode 2. The length is way better than Episode 1 also. It's probably twice as long at like 4, maybe 5 hours if you take your time. My biggest issue with the game is really the ending. The game has a pretty notorious cliffhanger ending that still has really not been concluded all these years later, and yeah, that just kind of bothers me at this point. And really, all these years later, I'm pretty doubtful that we'll ever see a conclusion to this game, which is quite disheartening. But I still think that Episode 2 is absolutely worth playing. It is a great game, and it does have a lot going for it. And so here we have Half-Life 1. Now, between Half-Life 1 and 2, it is very hard for me to decide which game I think is better and which one I like more. I have a ton of nostalgia for both, and I think they are both some of the very best first-person shooters ever made. And truthfully, I flip-flop between Half-Life 1 and 2 of which one I like more. But on this day, whatever day this video is uploaded, I am choosing Half-Life 1 as my number 2. So Half-Life 1, you don't really need me to go over it. It was an incredibly groundbreaking game for not only the first-person shooter genre, but video games in general, and it set the standard for storytelling in shooters, and it just had some really great gameplay to it, and the game has aged incredibly well all these years later. You play as Gordon Freeman, a scientist at the Black Mesa Research Center, and you're just doing some experiments when all shit hits the fan, and basically a bunch of aliens invade this world and take over the center, and you're just trying to figure out how to stop this and help everyone. At this point in gaming, first-person shooters never really had a story, or if they did, it was very basic. It was maybe a wall of text at most, but not Half-Life. Half-Life was different. It had a full-on story with characters and had a lot of plot progression, and the way they did storytelling was very differently. It was exclusively in first person. It never left Gordon's eyes. It was very seamless. It was very different also from how shooters were back then, and even nowadays it's still pretty different. The whole world is seamless as well, as Half-Life's world is all one level. It's not segmented, it's not level based, it's all together. Rather than having levels, these areas have scripted sequences, which I know doesn't sound all that crazy, but for the time it was pretty crazy. But even coming back to it, these scripted sequences are actually still pretty good. The game has a lot of variety to it, and the pacing of the campaign is actually totally solid. It is still very well done. The game starts with the slow tram ride, really building up the anticipation of what's gonna happen. Then when shit hits the fan, it starts you off with the weak enemies before finally introducing the military and really just continuing to ramp things up until you're finally in Zen, the alien homeworld. I really just can't say enough good things about the pacing. The level design is equally just as good, as it isn't just a bunch of random corridors thrown all around. No, it actually seems like a place that people could work at. It seems like a real environment for the most part. Sure, there are plenty of areas where I guess you'd have to suspend your disbelief for a little bit, but for the most part it is actually pretty realistically designed. And then there's a lot of puzzles here also, whether it's just trying to figure out where to go next, flipping some switches, or doing some platforming. Most of the puzzles actually hold up pretty well. Something that doesn't hold up all that well is the platforming. It is kind of janky, if we're being honest. The crouch jumping isn't amazing. I mean, it's fine enough. It could be a hell of a lot worse, but it's one of the aspects that hasn't aged all that well. Speaking of not aging that well, there is a few scripted sequences here that I don't really love all that much, especially coming back to them, but most of these are pretty good. But when you're not doing all of that, you're getting into some combat encounters. You're actually doing the shooting in the first-person shooter, and you know, the combat, it hasn't aged as well as Half-Life 2, but it still is pretty good. The game has a variety of weapons, from the iconic crowbar to the pistols to the shotguns, machine guns, rocket launchers, crossbow, etc. And all of these weapons are pretty great. I love how all of them feel. It's all satisfying. The combat is impactful. It does have a nice feel to it. And then the actual encounters themselves are really well done, because encountering every enemy is different. You'll want to use a certain weapon for certain enemies, and then just depending on the enemy itself, you might have a completely different attack strategy for. Such as the aliens, you'll want to take cover and use a shotgun, but if it's maybe the military, you'll want to just rush them and blast them head on. There's a number of different enemies, weapons, and tactics you can use, and you'll get some success with pretty much everything, but you'll really want to hone in your strategies when it comes to certain enemies here. I know over the years people have said Half-Life's combat isn't amazing and it's the world building and all of that sells the game, but I actually do think the combat is still pretty good. It's more than functional. I mean, I think it still holds up decently well also. But Half-Life really is the complete package. It has the great story, the world building, the level design, the pacing, the combat. It really has just about everything you're looking for a first-person shooter. It is one of those unforgettable experiences that I think every gamer should try in some capacity. Half-Life 1 is obviously available for the PC. There's the shitty Source version, but it was released on the PS2 as Half-Life Decay or whatever. I don't recommend that version, but now there's also the full completed remake of Half-Life known as Black Mesa. This is pretty great also. It does address some of the issues I have with the original Half-Life, some of the areas that haven't aged all that well, but it does add its own little areas that I also don't think are all that great. Really, I just recommend playing the original over all these other versions. I think the original is the best way to go, and I think that everybody needs to try it. It is just fantastic. But I don't think it's the best Half-Life. I think Half-Life 2 is the very best when it comes to the Half-Life series, Valve games in general, and first-person shooters. It might be the very best first-person shooter, and that really is saying a lot. That's a really big feat, but when it comes to first-person shooters, not many are as good as Half-Life 2. This game has been praised to hell for the last 20 years at this point, and for very good reason. It's Half-Life 2. It is just a superb game. The game takes place many, many years after Half-Life 1, and Gordon is sent back to Earth after the events of Half-Life 1. It turns out Earth has been completely taken over by a new alien force known as the Combine, and they're pretty much killing off the human race, and it's up to Gordon to just do anything at this point. The story, the world, the characters, the way everything goes in Half-Life 2, I have nothing but the highest praise for. It is just phenomenal. It is crazy interesting. The world building is just so good, and the details that they provide and that you can find around the areas, like, it's just so good. I dare you to find that many first-person shooters that have this level of world building in them. You aren't going to find many because it's just that good. Like the first game, it stays in first person and all of the world is connected. It's not levels, it's not segmented. There's a bunch of set pieces here and there's way more variety here than the first game, but it's all together and it's all incredibly seamless, and the pacing is just so good. You get out on that train and you just kind of take in the world. It's all a bit slow. Things quickly ramp up though, especially with the Combine. You have to escape and things just keep going and ramping up more and more, and it's just incredibly different. This game is so varied. Like, every area is very different from the last, and it just always stays interesting, and it's all good. I wouldn't say there's a single part of this game that is bad, hasn't aged well, or anything even like that. It's all just fantastic. It is tightly crafted, paced, and it's just incredibly engaging. I remember the first time I ever played Half-Life 2 and really got into it, I was in like middle school and I just couldn't put it down. I didn't play anything else for a couple days. I was so engrossed by the world and the areas and the combat and the physics. Oh yeah, the physics. So the physics were kind of in Half-Life 1, but the physics play a major part in Half-Life 2. It really is one of the best games to show off physics, especially thanks to the gravity gun. Physics are a huge part of Half-Life 2, whether you're throwing stuff around, using it to platform, or you're using this amazingly cool gun known as the gravity gun, where you pick shit up and you throw it around and use it as a weapon. It's great stuff. While it could appear a little gimmicky, I assure you it really isn't. It is a core fundamental part of Half-Life 2's design, and it really adds to it. It doesn't take anything away, and it really just makes it even more engrossing, and it actually adds to the puzzles a lot more as well. There's a lot of physics puzzles here. The puzzles are just all around better design than Half-Life 1's. They're not as repetitive or obvious, and it keeps the level design from feeling even close to stale. It keeps everything very interesting, and it plays a big part in the combat as well, as you can use the gravity gun to throw shit around, and that's really fun. It's always been fun. And then there's the weapons. There's a bunch of returning weapons, there's some new weapons, there's a bunch of new enemies, especially the Combine. They play a big part here, and their AI is so much better than any of the AI in the old Half-Life. Like, it is really great when it comes to enemy AI, team AI. It's actually just really well done. I think the combat is real swell. It's probably better in Episode 2 than this game, but this game just has everything else going for it that makes it the better game overall. Now, when it comes to playing Half-Life 2, absolutely, everybody should play Half-Life 2. It's a fantastic, just amazing, mind-blowing game, really. There's a couple different versions to play of it now, but the best really is still on the PC, on Steam. It's super cheap. It's been updated graphically, so it looks even better than it did back then. You even get Half-Life Lost Coast, a deleted scene, ooh, and Half-Life Deathmatch, ooh, like nobody's playing it, who cares, but whatever, you get it for free, basically. But over the years, Half-Life 2 has really become one of my favorite games just ever. I think almost everybody can agree that it's just phenomenal. It is one of the very best games probably ever made, and for good reason. It's just that good. I have no problem saying to check out the Half-Life series. There's the crazy modding scene, there's all the mods that are available for Half-Life. No, there's no reason for anybody to not try Half-Life unless they really don't like first-person shooters. And I could really be here all day talking about how great Half-Life is, so I'm just going to end it right here. I hope everyone has a fantastic day, night, whatever. See everyone later. Comment bricks if you made it to this part. Bye-bye.